My name is Marina Cole, and I was 31 years old the afternoon a lawyer slid a single sheet of paper across a cold conference table and told me that my father had left me a gift. The word gift sat in the air between us like a joke nobody had finished telling. On that same table, my stepmother Gloria had just been handed a portfolio thick enough to thud when it landed, and my two half-brothers, Derek and Brent, had each received sealed envelopes the lawyer described as substantial. I watched their faces open the way faces do when money confirms what a person has always believed about themselves. Then the lawyer turned to me. Mr. Cole designated the property at 14 Harrow Road, specifically the original structure and surrounding acreage, to his eldest daughter, Marina. He cleared his throat the way men clear their throats when they are delivering something they personally find embarrassing. The structure has been assessed as uninhabitable. There are outstanding liens attached to the land in the amount of $42,000. He paused. Your father also left a handwritten note. The note was 7 words. I know you can figure it out. Gloria laughed first. She did not cover her mouth or pretend to cough. She laughed openly, the way a woman laughs when she has been waiting a long time to see someone get exactly what she believes they deserve. Derek leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, that tracks." Brent said nothing, but his smile said enough. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. I did not cry. I had learned not to cry in front of people who would record the memory and play it back to me later as proof of weakness. I drove to 14 Harrow Road that same evening. I had not visited in almost 9 years, not since my father married Gloria, and the house I had grown up running through became a place I was tolerated in rather than welcomed. The structure that greeted me in the dying light of that October afternoon was not even a house anymore. The roof on the east wing had partially collapsed. The front porch sagged like a mouth with missing teeth. Vines had climbed the brick and were prying apart the mortar the way time pries apart everything people forget to tend. The land around it was 12 acres of overgrown field, 2 dry creeks, and a stand of old-growth oak trees so tall their canopy blocked out the last of the evening sun. I stood in the middle of all of it and felt something I did not expect. I felt still. My father and I had not had an easy relationship. He was a man who loved in the way some people cook, functionally, with whatever ingredients were available, and without much warmth. When my mother died, I was 9, and he responded by working more hours and speaking fewer words. By the time Gloria came into our lives, I had already learned to need very little from him. But I had inherited his stubbornness, his refusal to accept a verdict before all the evidence was in. 7 words on a piece of paper. I know you can figure it out. Maybe that was the most honest thing he ever said to me. I slept in my car that first night, parked at the edge of the property, because driving back to my apartment in the city felt like retreating, and I was not ready to retreat. I had $1,400 in my checking account, a graphic design job that paid enough to survive on, and $42,000 of debt attached to land most people would have signed away before the meeting was over. I got out a legal pad and started writing. Not a plan, not yet. Just every resource I could think of that I actually had. I wrote for 2 hours. By the time the field turned gray with early morning light, I had 4 pages. Gloria called me the next morning at 7:14. She did not ask how I was. She asked whether I had considered the option of selling the property back to the estate for a fair settlement. I asked what fair meant. She said the estate's appraiser had valued the land at $60,000, which after the liens would leave me approximately $18,000. I thanked her politely and ended the call. $60,000 for 12 acres of land, 20 minutes outside a city, whose real estate market had been expanding north for 3 consecutive years. I opened my laptop and started reading. What I found in the next 72 hours changed the entire map of what my father had left me. The 12 acres at 14 Harrow Road sat at the edge of a development corridor that the county had quietly rezoned 18 months earlier. 3 commercial builders had already purchased adjacent parcels. A regional grocery chain was under contract for a site 2 lots over. The land itself, stripped of the ruins sitting on it, was worth not $60,000 but somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000, depending on how it was packaged and to whom. My father had known. He had known, and he had left it to me anyway, and 7 words were suddenly knotted to me. Sal, they were instructions. I did not call Gloria back. I called a real estate attorney named Priya Nair, whose name I found on a community legal resources board. I explained my situation in one sitting. Priya listened without interrupting, which was the first sign she was good at her job. She told me the liens could be addressed before any sale or development conversation, that there were mechanisms for that, and she asked whether I was interested in selling or developing. I told her I did not know yet. She said that was the right answer, and we should keep both doors open. She charged me a sliding scale consultation fee and told me to stop answering Gloria's calls until we had a strategy. Over the next 3 months, I lived in two worlds simultaneously. In the first world, I drove to work, met deadlines, designed brand identities for companies whose names I would forget by the following year, and paid my rent. In the second world, I drove out to Harrow Road on weekends, pulled on work gloves, and began clearing the site. Not renovating, just clearing. Removing debris, cutting back vines, mapping the usable acreage foot by foot. I photographed everything. I documented the oak grove with a precision that surprised even me. A conservation nonprofit I contacted told me the trees were likely over 120 years old and potentially eligible for a preservation designation that would actually increase the land's value to certain buyers rather than limit it. I also hired, on a deferred payment agreement, a structural engineer named Carl who owed Priya a favor. Carl walked through the collapsed structure and told me something nobody else had bothered to assess. The original stone foundation, the part everyone could see was crumbling, was sitting on top of a second, older foundation, hand-laid limestone, probably from the early 1900s, that was in remarkable condition. The ruin had a skeleton worth saving if someone wanted to build into it rather than over it. Boutique hospitality developers, Carl said, paid premiums for exactly that kind of bones. By month 4, I had 3 offers. The first was from a residential developer who wanted to scrape everything and put up townhouses. The second was from a land banking company that wanted to hold and flip. The third was from a small hospitality group called Terrain Projects, 2 women who converted historic rural structures into luxury event venues. They walked the property on a Tuesday morning in February, stood in the middle of the oak grove for a long time without saying anything, and then offered me a partnership rather than a straight purchase. They would fund the development. I would retain 40% ownership and a seat at the table. The completed venue, they projected, would generate between $800,000 and $1.2 million in annual bookings within 3 years of opening. I said yes. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it would be easy to skip over the part where I was terrified. I had never owned anything worth more than my car. I had never negotiated a contract that ran longer than 2 pages. I had never stood in a room where the stakes were high enough that losing meant losing not just money, but the future I had quietly built in my head during those long weekends of clearing brush and photographing oak trees. Priya sat beside me at every meeting. She was the kind of lawyer who made other lawyers nervous, calm and precise, and completely unimpressed by posturing. I signed the partnership agreement on a Thursday and cried in the parking garage afterward, alone, which was the right place for it. Gloria found out 6 weeks later. I am still not entirely sure how. My best guess is that the county permit filings became public record, and someone in her social circle connected the address to the estate. She called me on a Saturday morning, and this time her voice had lost the casual cruelty it usually carried. She sounded careful. She said she had heard I was developing the Harrow Road property and that she thought we should have a conversation as a family. I told her I was happy to have that conversation with my attorney present. The careful voice went away immediately. Marina, your father would have wanted us to handle this together. I let the sentence sit there for a moment. My father had written 7 words and left me ruins and $42,000 in debt, while his widow received a portfolio thick enough to thud on a table. Priya will reach out to schedule something, I said, and I ended the call. What came next was not subtle. Within 2 weeks, Gloria had retained her own attorney and sent a formal letter claiming that the Harrow Road property had been improperly excluded from the estate's primary asset division, and that she intended to contest the bequest on the grounds that my father had been experiencing cognitive decline at the time the will was amended. It was a thin argument. The will had been amended 14 months before my father's death, witnessed by 2 people and notarized, during a period when he was by every medical record an alert and functioning man. But thin arguments, Priya explained, do not need to be strong. They only need to be expensive enough to make the other person give up. Derek called me the same week. He used a different approach than his mother, more personal, almost friendly. He said he understood the position I was in and that nobody blamed me for being confused about the property's value. He said the family just wanted to make sure things were equitable. I asked him what equitable meant. He said it meant that if the land turned out to be worth significantly more than the estate's appraisal had suggested, it was only fair that the proceeds be divided among all of my father's children. I told him I would let Priya know he had called. He stopped sounding friendly. Brent tried a different angle entirely. He showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Wednesday evening with a bottle of wine and the expression of someone attempting sincerity under difficult conditions. He sat on my couch and told me quietly that he actually felt bad about the whole thing. He said he remembered what it was like when my mother died, and I was just a little kid, and his mother came in and everything changed. He said he was not like Derek and Gloria. He said he thought I deserved something. Then he said he thought the fair thing would be for me to buy him out of his theoretical share for a reasonable sum, say $80,000, and the three of them would drop the contest. I poured the wine down the sink after he left. The legal challenge proceeded, and it was as expensive as Priya had warned me it would be. I borrowed against my future equity in the Terrain Projects partnership, a decision that required me to sign documents that made my hands shake, and I paid Priya to fight. She fought methodically. She produced the medical records. She produced the notary's testimony. She produced a deposition from my father's personal accountant, a quiet man named Harold who had worked with my father for 22 years, and who testified, with the flat certainty of a man who keeps receipts, that my father had been fully aware of the Harrow Road property's potential, and had made the bequest intentionally and with specific reasoning that he had communicated to Harold directly. Harold also testified that my father had originally intended to leave me a cash sum equivalent to what Derek and Brent received, but had changed his mind when he came to believe, based on conversations he'd had with Gloria, that I would not be capable of managing it. I sat in that deposition room and felt something I did not have a name for yet. My father had doubted me. He had been persuaded to doubt me. And then, somewhere in that last year of his life, he had changed his mind again, not by giving me cash, but by giving me the one thing he believed in enough to keep. The land, the ruins, the thing everyone else saw as worthless. The legal challenge was dismissed. The judge found no credible evidence of cognitive impairment and noted, in language that Priya told me was unusually pointed for a probate ruling, that the contested bequest appeared to reflect a deliberate and personal intention on the part of the deceased. Gloria's attorney filed a motion for reconsideration. It was denied. By the time the legal battle ended, Terrain Projects had broken ground on the Harrow Road venue. I drove out on the first day of construction and stood at the edge of the oak grove and watched a crane position the first steel beam into the restored limestone foundation. The lead architect, a woman named Cecile who wore paint-stained work boots to every site meeting, had designed the structure to grow out of the original walls rather than replace them. Guests would walk through preserved stone archways into a modern interior that looked like the past, and the present had agreed on something together. I had named the venue before we broke ground. I called it Remnant. Building Remnant took 14 months. I worked my graphic design job through 11 of those months, because the partnership covered construction costs but not my rent, and because I had learned by then that the only reliable bridge between where you are and where you are going is the work you do every single day without waiting to feel ready. I drove out to the site on weekends. I learned the names of every subcontractor. I sat in planning meetings and asked questions that sometimes made the room uncomfortable and asked them anyway. Cecile told me once that I was the most present owner she had ever worked with. I told her I had nowhere else I would rather be. The venue opened on a Saturday in late spring, and the first event booked was a wedding. 200 guests in the oak grove with string lights overhead, and the old stone walls wrapped in climbing white roses that the land. Scape team had planted the previous autumn specifically so they would bloom by opening weekend. I stood at the edge of the property during the reception and watched strangers dance under the trees my father had never once mentioned to me, and I thought about the way some people leave things behind not because they do not love you, but because they have run out of words for what they feel and decide that objects will have to speak instead. 7 words and a ruin. It turned out that was enough. Gloria sent a text the week after Remnant's opening. She had seen a magazine feature on new event venues in the region, and Remnant had been included. The text said, "Congratulations, I always knew you had it in you. I read it 3 times the way you read something you want to make sure you understood correctly. Then I deleted it, not in anger, but in the way you set down a thing you have been carrying long enough." I did not respond. Derek found a different method of reaching out. He followed Remnant's business account on social media and left a comment on our opening weekend post. "So proud of my sister," it said, with a red heart. I had the social media manager, a young woman named Yolanda who had incredible instincts, remove the comment and block the account. Yolanda did not ask why. She simply said, "Got it," and moved on, which was one of many reasons I trusted her. Brent I did not hear from for almost 4 months. When I finally did, it was not a message or a comment. It was a legal notice. He had retained a new attorney, separate from Gloria's, and was filing a claim against me personally, alleging that I had benefited from a fiduciary arrangement he claimed my father had verbally promised him access to during a family dinner 3 years before the will was amended. The claim was what Priya called creative. She also called it expensive. She also called it something else that I will not repeat, but her expression when she said it told me everything I needed to know. I want to tell you that I handled this second wave of legal pressure with steady calm and total equanimity. I want to tell you I never sat on the floor of my bathroom at 11 at night wondering if it was all going to be taken from me by people who had not worked a single day to build it. That would be a cleaner story. The truth is that there were nights when the fear was as physical as anything I had ever felt. But I had learned, during those weekends of clearing brush in a field full of dead vines and ruined wood, that fear is not a reason to stop. Fear is just weather. You put on the right gear and you keep moving. Priya demolished Brent's claim in 3 months. There was no documentation, no witnesses, no corroboration of any kind for a verbal promise made at a dinner that, as Harold confirmed under oath, he had also attended and had no memory of. The claim was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Brent could not refile it. His attorney withdrew shortly afterward. By Remnant's first full year of operation, the venue had booked 114 events. Weddings, corporate retreats, editorial photo shoots, a documentary film that used the Oak Grove for 3 days and left a stunning credit sequence behind. Annual revenue came in at $940,000, inside terrain projects projection range and climbing. My 40% share after operating costs was more money than I had earned in the previous 4 years of my life combined. I paid off the original liens. I paid Priya in full. I put the rest into a fund I opened under a name nobody in my family knew. I also made one more decision that I had been circling for months, without being ready to land on it. I hired a private estate researcher, a woman named Doris who had 30 years of experience in asset documentation, and I asked her to go through every record connected to my father's estate. Not to challenge anything, not to reopen the legal wounds, but to understand. I needed to know whether what Harold had said in deposition was the whole picture, whether there were things my father had intended that never made it into any document. Doris found 2 things. The first was a letter my father had drafted but never sent, addressed to me, dated 8 months before his death. In it, he wrote about the land in a way I had never heard him speak about anything. He described buying it when he was 26, broke, newly married to my mother, convinced that land was the only thing that kept its meaning when everything else changed. He wrote that he had watched me grow up and recognized something in me he could not name when I was a child but understood now. He called it the ability to see what a thing could be instead of only what it was. He said he was sorry he had not said that to me in person. He said he had planned to. He said the land was the best way he knew to say it now. The second thing Doris found was a clause in the original estate plan that Gloria's attorney not disclosed during the probate process. A small investment account, not large, $47,000, that my father had placed in a separate trust designated specifically for my name, which had been administratively absorbed into the general estate during settlement and dispersed along with other funds. It was an error, or it was not an error. Priya's expression when I showed her the documentation suggested she had a strong opinion about which one it was. We filed a recovery claim. It was settled quietly, quickly, and in full with legal fees covered by the estate. Gloria did not call after that. I am 34 now. Remnant is preparing to open a second property, a converted mill on 7 acres that Cecile has already started sketching. Terrain projects and I are equal partners on the new site. I still drive out to Harrow Road sometimes, not for meetings, just to walk the oak grove in the early morning when the light comes through the canopy at an angle that makes everything look like it was arranged deliberately. I think about my father on those mornings in the way I think about complicated things, with patience and some grief, and a lot of respect for the parts I will never fully understand. He was not a man who knew how to say I love you without the words getting tangled on the way out. What he knew how to do was hold onto something long after other people would have let go, and then leave it to the only person he trusted to understand why he had. I was angry at him for a long time. I was angry at the ruins, at the debt, at the 7 words, at the fact that everyone else received certainty while I received a question. But the question turned out to be the gift. Gloria and Derek and Brent had been given answers. I had been given a problem to solve. And I had solved it in the only way that actually creates something worth keeping, by beginning where I was, using what I had, and refusing to accept other people's definitions of what the land was worth. I have not spoken to Gloria since the recovery claim settled. I have not spoken to Derek since Yolanda blocked his account. I have spoken to Brent once, briefly, at a distance, at a community event where we both happened to be. He looked smaller than I remembered. He said, "You did well." I nodded and walked toward the people I had come to see, not out of cruelty, simply because some distances, once opened, become the shape of the space you need to breathe. My father left me ruins. He left me debt and vines, and a collapsed roof, and a limestone foundation that nobody had bothered to look at closely enough to understand. He left me 7 words that took me 3 years to fully read. And when my family tried to take what I had built from all of it, I discovered the one thing they had never counted on. I had built it by learning to stand in the middle of something broken and see not what it was, but what it was going to be. You cannot take that from a person. You can only make them prove it, and they did, and I was glad, because proof is permanent in a way that promises never are. The oak trees at Remnant are strung with lights every weekend from April through October. Wedding guests walk under them and take photographs and make memories they will talk about for decades. Nobody knows that I slept in my car at the edge of that field on the first night I owned it. Nobody knows about the 42,000 in liens, or the months of clearing brush alone, or the nights on the bathroom floor, or the legal notices, or the comment Yolanda quietly deleted. Nobody needs to know. What they see is the light through the canopy, and the old stone walls, and the music and the flowers. And what I know is everything it took to make the ruin into something that beautiful. My father was right, I figured it out.